Tom Tierney of the Sociandro Department. I've been asked to moderate tonight's event. I'm very happy to do so. I'm not going to say much. I'll just introduce the topic tonight. This conversation is part of a larger national conversation about living wage, which really began in the 1990s. Initially, it was a policy that was adopted by municipalities under pressure from unions and community organizers to adopt a living wage. I think Baltimore was the first community that did so. It required public employees to be paid a living wage, and anybody who contracted with the city of Baltimore. It spread throughout the country. Hundreds of cities and municipalities now have such a policy. In the late 90s, it spread to universities. I think Harvard was the first, of course. And since then, it spread to other universities and colleges across the country. Small liberal arts colleges like Swarthmore. This past summer, University of California adopted a $15 an hour minimum wage policy for the entire state system, which is the third largest employer in California. So this conversation is part of a much larger conversation the country is having about income inequality. The event is sponsored by the Living Wage Campaign, a student organization that meets on Sundays, 1 p.m. in Lowry 119. The format tonight, we have three panelists, Linda Morgan-Clement, the chaplain of the campus and the director of Office of Interfaith Campus Ministry, Amies Moladina from the Economics Department, and Chuck Cameron from Religious Studies. We had another staff person who withdrew at the last minute. And the format is going to be, I will ask each panelist a question that was prepared by the Living Wage Campaign. They'll respond. We'll go through all three panelists, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. And it'll be just an open conversation at that point. So thank you all for coming, and we'll begin. Linda, you'll take the first question. This is not one that was on the script. All right. What kinds of responsibilities do we have as an institution of higher learning to ensure the well-being of all members of our community?
So I like this question and I don't like this question. I think my answers. I think that as an institution of higher learning, we should have an obligation if our goal is to educate emerging adults to be citizens in our society. If we're talking about citizenship, I think that citizenship by the institution is as important or more important than citizenship by the individual. I think for Worcester especially, regardless of us being in that larger circle of being higher education, given our roots, founded by Presbyterians and that kind of religious and Christian grounding, which even if we don't stay with it particularly, has a definite focus on the well-being of the community. But more importantly, I think it ties to our mission and our learning outcomes. One of my favorite images or metaphors for what we're trying to do here, if you look at all the outcomes that all of you are supposed to have when you leave the College of Wooster, besides your IS, it includes things like citizenship, respect for diversity, ability to add new knowledge to the community. And I think all of those things require that we create an environment in which you are learning, where you are exposed to that kind of diversity that isn't just visual diversity always, but includes socioeconomic class diversity, where you are asked to struggle with and wrestle with questions of how do we answer these difficult questions, to critique capitalism and Marxism and all the other kinds of economic systems, and to dream a new world. And I don't think we do you a good service unless we begin to, as an institution and as those who are teaching you and learning along with you, really take seriously our community of learners. I would say that we have, at the College of Wooster specifically, a high degree of responsibility to look to the well-being of all our members. Jillian said the other day when she was with the president-elect, she articulated the fact that all of you are here on a residential campus. She probably did it better than I can this evening. And that is part of our commitment to you. And that the people who are taking care of you, making sure that they take your hair out of the showers, who are cleaning your restrooms, who are dragging 25 or 30 garbage bags full of garbage out of your dorm rooms to clean up when you accidentally drink too much on a Wednesday night, which doesn't happen very often. All of those pieces are part of your educational experience. and those people who are helping educate you by taking care of you, by having conversations with you that maybe you wouldn't want to tell your professor what happened, or that there are things happening in your family that they might understand more than you do, are people that we deserve to be taken care of so that their well-being adds to your well-being. So those are some of my initial thoughts about our obligation. I would say the final thing is that as human beings, and as we understand more and more that we are tied together, each of us and us with our environment, our obligation becomes one of reality.
Thanks, Linda. The second question is Professor Molodina. What are the proximate factors of income inequality in the United States?
Okay. Okay, can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, wow. So I get the hard question. I think, at least it was very hard for me to think about this topic. The first thing that I want to say, income inequality is a really difficult thing to understand. And it's very easy to look at statistics and lie with statistics. In fact, I want to teach a class on how to lie with statistics. How many of you, after looking at the research on this, I think. So, the first question that you have to ask when you're thinking about inequality is, what kind of inequality are you looking at? So, are you interested in people's wages? Sometimes, some people choose to live in family units, which we call households. So are you looking at household wages? And then you have to ask the question, well, what is a household? What does a household look like in the United States or in other parts of the world? You can talk about wages and you can talk about income, and those two things are very different. Wages are what you earn for having worked. Income, however, can come from many sources. So, for example, you can, if you're a very low income person, sometimes you get, if you're lucky, transfers from the government. If you have savings, say for example in a bank, you get interest income. If you have the good fortune to have saved some funds in a mutual fund or in the stock market and so on and so forth, then you get income from those sources. If you have land and so on and so forth, then you get income from those sources. So the next then question becomes as well, okay, what about, are we looking at wage inequality? Are we looking at income inequality? And then there's a larger story of, are we looking at wealth inequality, which is an even larger category of things. So whenever you look at the statistics, the first thing you need to interrogate is, which inequality are you looking at? And for our conversations, I think what matters here is really the wage inequality story. The second thing that you need to be thinking about is what measure you need to use, because the measure, i.e. the way you compute the statistic, really determines the story that you're going to tell. So, for example, many people look at the Gini coefficient, which many of you have heard of, and that's probably the most famous measure, and it looks at the whole distribution and it sees whether you deviate from perfect equality. Perfect equality means that if you are 1% of the population of people that you're interested in, you should earn 1% of the income. So we're looking at deviations from that. There's some serious problems with the Gini coefficient, but so there are other measures like standard deviation, the top 1% relative to the bottom 50%, and so on and so forth. So there's all of these different measures, and each of these different measures tells a different story. Okay? And then the third complication is, what's your data set? So the one that's used the most is in the US, is the current population survey. It captures about 60,000 people in the US. So not everyone, it captures only 60,000. So all of you are very smart liberal arts students. You know that, what does that mean? How many people are there in the US? More than 60,000, okay? So clearly we're missing some people, right? We could miss some people, but we do our job with stats really well, so we can compute a representative sample, okay? So, the folks at the Bureau of Labor Statistics that collect the CPS data do a pretty good job. But it's only 60,000, okay? There's another survey called the Panel Survey of Income Dynamics. This is one of the oldest surveys that exists, and it was started in the 60s. The purpose was to look at poverty and income in the US. So they picked a sample of people in 1960, let me get this right, 1968. And they tried to figure out what was happening to their incomes over generations. And they only picked 2,000 poor families and 3,000 other families, so 5,000 people. Representative, of course. But there's some people that happen to show up after 1968 in the US that are not represented in the 5,000. So again, we have some problems there. Okay, so anyone that studies inequality needs to think about all of these things before they even start. And this is really important because you may not capture the people that you're really interested in helping. So that's my big caveat, okay? So what are the causes of wage inequality in the US? There's quite a bit of research on this. A recent paper by Jonathan Heathcott looked at inequality over time, and in the 70s is when sort of it starts to rise quite significantly. In the 70s, using different measures, many different measures of wage inequality, and many different data sets as well, there's a clear trend that the inequality is going up. So if anyone doubts that inequality is going up, there's no doubt about it, okay? So since the 70s, inequality as a whole has increased. It doesn't matter what data set you look at, doesn't matter what measure you use, that's clear. In the 1970s, the inequality was growing because the bottom half, okay, was decreasing faster, okay? And then in the 1980s, what was happening was the bottom half was going down and the upper half was rising as well. So the whole distribution was diverging, if you will. And then in the 1990s, the top half of the distribution started to go up, and the bottom part has since sort of stabilized. So that's the story of inequality over time. The reason for why the top part is rising is you and me. It's education. Okay, there's a bias in the U.S. economy, and there's been an increased demand for skilled workers, and there's not enough of you guys. So that's raising the upper part of the distribution quite dramatically. There are other stories as well that relate to wealth and so on and so forth, and generations and so on and so forth. But the major story, the story that turns out to be important for the top part of the distribution is us. Okay. The bottom part of the distribution is very, very interesting. It's a story you may have learned about in your social classes and your other classes. The first thing that happened in the 70s was the unions decline. And one of the things that unions do is they bargain for higher wages for their workers. And because the power of the unions declined, the ability to bargain up those low-wage jobs, if you will, went away. So that was the first thing that happened. The second thing that happened is a lot of the low-wage jobs, the demand for the low-wage jobs decreased. Why? Because the skills that were required to do those jobs basically were no longer needed, or they changed. So a lot of people talk about technology, and a lot of people talk about the fact that US manufacturing changed. Okay, and it changed in the way that manufacturing shifted to other countries, shifted south out of the Rust Belt states, the Midwest, and so on and so forth. And then also the way in which we produce things changed. Okay, so that's another story. And then the other really interesting story is the minimum wage story, and that really kicked in the 80s. The minimum wage, the federal minimum wage, actually didn't budge much. And so in real terms, if inflation is rising, so the cost of living is rising, and you're still getting the minimum wage, what you actually are able to afford when you go to the grocery store or basically declines. So the minimum wage was really it was a floor. It was stopping the bottom from completely falling out, but the real income was falling. So people's purchasing power was deteriorating, and because that minimum wage wasn't being raised, people were worse off. So that's really the story that as to what are the proximate causes of this income inequality that we've been seeing in the United States. The story is of course different if you look at other parts of the world. There's another really interesting story about the government, and there was a really interesting article in today's New York Times about this. The government is giving less and less to the very, very poor. The government is giving a larger percentage of their handouts to folks that are working, and folks that are in the they're very close to the poverty line. So I would say that if this is the poverty line, whatever that means, okay, they are slightly above and slightly below. But the folks that are the poorest of the poor, the folks that don't have jobs, that don't even have the capabilities to go out and find a job, are getting less and less and less and less. So there's a really interesting story there that one needs to be telling. I think also there's a lack of imagination with a lot of firms as well, because firms in the US don't really know, there aren't too many firms that really know how to employ people very, very, very well. But maybe I'll talk about that in a separate conversation. So I think there's something there that's happening. That's interesting. I'll stop there.
Okay, our third question, which will set up a larger conversation, is to Professor Kammer. If you could explain what a living wage actually is and the moral arguments for it, the pragmatic implications, and then the main question is it possible to implement a living wage at the College of Wooster?
So let me start
Yes or
with
no?
the last part of that question. Absolutely yes. And let me go back to the point I want to make here in the beginning. It's great to see a lot of you here this evening. We could talk a little bit about why we need a living wage on campus, and I'll do that. One of the things I want to note, however, is any place that living wage has been successful, it's been successful because of the people who are low income or students who are working on their behalf. So if living wage is going to happen on this campus, it will happen because students get engaged, faculty will support as best they can. It will take a significant movement and commitment from many, many, many of you. Not all of you in this room can be actively engaged, I'm sure, because of time and space on the living wage campaign. But back in the various types of movements I've been involved in, there's something called the call. And that is, you make a commitment to a cause, and when the call goes out, we need so many people to support this, then you show up. So I want to invite all of you to think hard about this issue, keep your eyes open around the issue, think hard about the issue. When a call goes out, be ready to respond. Very quickly, however, back to, I guess, humanizing the issue and then giving moral arguments. I think most College of Wooster students have a deep concern for social issues, deep concerns for global poverty, poverty in the United States, race issues, gender issues. We often overlook the fact that we have issues right here on this campus. So we have workers on this campus who work 40 hours a week and who can't afford daycare. Workers who work 40 hours a week and their kids can't participate in sports or music activities. People who work 40 hours a week and who use the free meal programs in town and the free clinic because they don't have the resources to have what we would think of as a good or reasonable standard of living. We have workers on this campus who walk around with holes in their shoes because they can't buy a pair of shoes, and we could go on and on and on and on and on. And those are the people who are cleaning your bathrooms, vacuuming your rugs, trimming your trees, making your food, cleaning your dishes, so that you're free to pursue the kind of education that will allow you to move into a higher social class. So I want you to be aware of the fact that poverty exists and exists right here on this very, very campus, that many of our workers are working at a wage that keeps them below poverty level even though they're working 40 hours a week. So what is a living wage? Make a couple of distinctions. One of the distinctions has to do with the difference between what's called a subsistence wage and a living wage. Subsistence wage is simply that very minimal amount of income you would need to stay alive. And that's really all we're talking about. In some respects, the poverty line in the United States was set on the basis of a subsistence level back in the 1960s around a subsistence diet that persons had. So I won't go into all of that. Minimum wage is simply whatever the government decides to set, but has no relationship whatsoever to a living wage. Living wage is generally defined as a salary that would allow a person to participate fully in the society of which they are a part. Does not mean you have a Cadillac, does not mean you own a home, but it means you have a place to live. You have an adequate diet, you have transportation, you have health care, you have access to education, you can participate fully as a citizen. Your kids can participate fully in school, and that's a living wage. If you're interested in what that looks like, MIT, which I think is a fairly reputable institution in terms of doing math and data. So I had a friend who years ago used to tell the story of working in the Boston area and working in a grocery store with a sign that said 10 items or less. And a student came through carrying 14 items. And he said, "Are you from Harvard and can't count, or from MIT and can't read?" So if you come from MIT, you should be able to do math. You can go on and find something called the living wage calculator, which is then broken down by state and broken down by counties in each state. So clearly living wage is going to vary depending on where you live. If you live in New York City, living wage is going to be much higher than if you live in Wayne County. However, we discovered that we're looking at Wayne County, living wage is probably somewhere between $15 to $20 an hour, depending upon family size. Okay, but you can look and it'll give you some notion of the costs and expenses that people have, a nice breakdown. What do you spend on housing? What do you spend on child care? What do you spend on food? What do you spend on health care? Okay. So living wage is the concept that everybody who works should be compensated in a way that allows them to live a dignified life. So moral arguments. So some of mine come out, I think, of religious traditions, some of them come out of humanist traditions, but they begin with the notion that all persons have worth and all persons have value and should be treated with dignity. And if you're working 40 hours a week and you are living in poverty 40 hours a week and you can't pay your bills at the end of the month, you're not being treated with dignity at your workplace. So there's respect, but there's also dignity, and dignity is tied to what you get paid. Moral arguments, some of you may have heard, love your neighbor as yourself. What would you like to get paid? Suppose you're working in the dish room at the College of Wooster, making about $8 an hour in extreme heat. Loud noise, you can't talk, you spend most of your day with your fingers in other people's food. and you discover that you will have to work 35 years, 40 hours a week to make the same salary as the president of the college makes in 1 year. Are you being treated with respect and dignity? I think probably not. Second kind of notion, I guess, that fills into my moral principles is the notion that, in fact, the world was created, or the world exists, for the well-being of all persons. Historically, societies have understood that. There is, in my own tradition, the Christian tradition, the notion that goes all the way back to the early church, that if a poor person is unable to find a job and find the income they need to get by, and they take stuff from rich people, that is not theft. The theft has been perpetrated by the rich people who took away the well-being of those with lesser income. You can go to John Rawls if you don't want to hang around in the religious community. John Rawls has a principle in which he calls the veil of ignorance, in which you imagine yourself being plucked into a room, and you're told you're going to have to set up the ground rules for a society, and when you come out you live in that society. The problem is you don't know what position you'll be assigned. If you begin to reflect and think, you could be disabled, you could be old, you could be uneducated, you could be a person of color, you could be a woman, you could be a man, what kind of society would you want? We discover most persons say we want a society in which all of our basic needs will be met, no matter what our condition is. So I think those are the basic kind of moral arguments that I operate with. Can it be done at the College of Wooster? Absolutely. To raise everybody to about a $14 to $15 minimum wage would account for about 1% to 2% of our budget. Not a whole lot. It can be done by shifting priorities, can be done by decreasing salaries at the top, mine included. I once had a conversation with the past president who said, you seem to think I make too much money. I said, Grant, I make too much money. If I'm making too much money, I know you're making too much money. So the issue is, I think, whether we have the moral commitment to pay people what they're worth. I guess the last thing I want to mention around the issues of how we establish wages. And we use kind of a supply-demand chart, kind of, but not entirely. But a supply-demand chart also doesn't recognize the value in different kinds of work. So we can take all of you well-educated people, and if we shift back to an Amish-style economy, none of you are worth much. I mean, quite honestly. All right? And an Amish is probably going to have to spend years and years and years teaching you to do anything that has any value. So there's certain kinds of work in our culture that we really undervalue. And I think our failure to pay people the wages they deserve undervalues that kind of work. I work with something called the Maslow pyramid in a modified form. Some of you may know it. Okay, at the core of every society, at the core of every human life are basic physical needs, and somebody has to do that work. And if your needs aren't being met at that level, then your higher level of needs, educational needs, spiritual needs can't be met. But for all of you to pursue your educational needs, somebody has to be doing the work on the bottom. You have to be fed, you have to be housed, you have to be comfortable, or you can't do your work. And so we don't value, I think, those people who are doing the base work in our society. That's the last piece I will say, I think. It's kind of one of my favorites. So I often ask people, who are the most important healthcare workers in any given society? Oh, doctors, researchers who are getting new vaccines. It turns out the most important people are farmers and sanitation workers. You move into a third world country, you get about 80 to 90% of your improvement in life expectancy by improving the diet and improving sanitation. The other 10% is modern medicine. But what do we pay sanitation workers compared to? So anyway, I think that's probably all I want to say at the moment. I try to keep that kind of quiet and objective.
Thanks to all the panelists. And now we can open the floor to questions.
Hey, how are you?
I want to just speak a little bit to what you've just said and present a few facts. We completely agree the MIT, first, we completely agree that people should have a living wage.
Okay.
And the tricky question, as was said, is what is a living wage? How do you figure out what that is? And we also agree that the MIT calculator is a pretty good way to start. Now, you mentioned that a living wage should enable a person to participate in society with dignity and so forth and so on. And I agree with that as well. If we look at the MIT calculator for Wayne County for a person, that calculation is approximately $9 an hour. There is no one at Worcester, and you may just be behind the curve on the facts, there is no one who's making $8 an hour, as you said. Our two lowest employees are making $9.68 and $9.84, so approximately an hour, a dollar over what the calculator claims. The other thing that's important in trying to figure this out is Worcester pays not only salary, but 35% above that in benefits. So if we look at that, our two lowest paid employees are making $13 an hour and a little more than that. So the MIT calculator says that a living wage in Wayne County is approximately $18,000, and the lowest paid workers, who are only two of our 500 workers, are making $27,000 as opposed to $18,000. And I should also note that the MIT calculator includes an assumption that you're going to need $2,000 a year for medical care. Worcester pays 80 to 89% of medical insurance. And I would urge students to ask their parents, do their employers pay 80 to 89% of their medical insurance? Worcester also pays for tuition. I would ask you to ask your parents how many of their employers are completely paying for your tuition. So I just think that's important to have the facts. The SPAC committee, which is charged with looking at this issue, is trying to figure this out. What is the right number? How do we, there's no question about wanting dignity and respect and a living wage for our workers. The tricky question is, what does that mean? How do you define it? Your calculation, Chuck, about 2% of the budget would accommodate a $15 an hour wage. I should say a number of places, both colleges and corporations, are obviously looking at this question. And aside from McDonald's, which did go for a $15 an hour living wage, most of the places that we've been looking at are looking at a $10 an hour living wage, and you can research that yourself. A calculation of how much it would cost for Worcester to do this is not, I respectfully submit, $1 million to $1.5 million, because that's not taking into account the fact that everybody's wage would have to be increased in order to avoid salary compression, and that there is the 35% benefit on top of that. So it's probably about $5 million, or about 6% of our budget. So that's all. We're on the same page, except that we're looking at the facts slightly differently.
You can probably hear me, yes? Yeah. I raised 4 kids, so. So a couple of things. I think there's some places where we are in agreement, and some places where I get deeply, deeply concerned because we do things with low-income people we don't do with the rest of the people. We don't ask the question, what is an excessive salary, which I think is a really, really interesting question, and we don't ever ask that. When we talk about faculty salaries and administrative salaries, we don't talk about the 35 to 40 to 50 or 60% of benefits that they receive is added onto their salary. When we hire a faculty member